Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the First World War in our continuing study of the history of civilization. I'd like to begin by looking at the Ottoman Empire. It had been begun in the 1300s by Osman, but then the Turks had taken Constantinople in 1453, and with that it had expanded into Eastern Europe, and of course it had passed all across North Africa. However, in 1877, the Ottomans went to war with Russia and lost to Russia, which gave them a bit of the nickname, the sick man of Europe. Now, meanwhile, Germany, Count Alfred von Schlieffen, had come up with the Schlieffen Plan, excuse my pronunciation, a strategic war plan developed in 1906 that said if Austria is attacked, then Germany would join. That is going to be a treaty that's formed. But the plan itself said that if Germany finds itself going to war with Russia, then it would also attack France. And so it was looking at the problem of a two-front war. The possibility was seen where they might be fighting both Russia and France, and it was determined in this plan to get in the first strike, that in case of war with Russia, it would be called for France to be attacked first, and then it was assumed that Russia would take a long time to mobilize, and they'd have plenty of time to defeat France and then go on to attack Russia. So this assumed a quick victory and that slow Russian mobilization. Europe in 1914 was held together by a number of different treaties. Germany and Austria-Hungary and Italy were all allied in what was called the Triple Alliance. Likewise, Great Britain, the United Kingdom, England, whatever name you're using, France and Russia had a series of treaties, but Russia also had a treaty with some of its allies, like Montenegro and Serbia. And so we were positioned. Have you ever taken dominoes and lined them up and you hit one and then the next falls down and the next falls down? And these countries were set up like dominoes where if one was attacked, all the others would eventually, by one treaty or another, by various entanglements, would be required to jump in. And the stage was set for the first domino to fall over and all the others would come crashing down. It took place June 28, 1914, with the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. He was visiting in Serbia. And earlier that day, they had actually found a bomb. Somebody had planted under his car, and they took it off and they dismantled it. And they thought, oh my, that was a close call. And those who had planned to do it, some Serbian nationals who resented having Austria's impact in their lives, they decided, well, the assassination attempt did not work, and they all sort of broke up and went home for the day. But the Archduke continued on his travels, and as chance would have it, one of the conspirators looked out the door of the restaurant where he'd stopped to have lunch, and here comes the Archduke. And he runs outside with his pistol, and he shoots and assassinates the Archduke. Now, with that, the Schlieffen Plan now goes into effect. Russia, first of all, Austria had declared war on Serbia, and Russia now declares war on Austria, and Germany finds itself now going to war with Russia. But before they can attack Russia, remember the plan called for them to first take out France, even though France wasn't even involved in the shooting. And so Germany immediately invades France with the plan called for them to sweep through Belgium. Now we're going to see the same thing taking place in World War II. It's going to be rather interesting, where there'd be a skirmish in the east, but then they would march through Belgium and they would quickly take Paris, and then France would fall, at least according to plan. However, they didn't quite plan on the people of Belgium fighting back. And so the battle for Belgium took just a bit longer than was planned. Notice this cartoon. You have Germany, the old man with a stick, and then the little child almost, Belgium, is saying, "No, you can't go this way." And notice the caption below, it says, "Bravo, Belgium." Well, they did hold up just a bit, but they were frankly outclassed and outgunned and quickly overcome. And those who resisted were treated as though they had been turncoats. Remember, Belgium was its own country, but the Germans very harshly just shot those who resisted. But that had given France a bit of breathing space, and even though the Germans passed through Belgium and now into France, they advanced fairly close to Paris. But now you have the First Battle of the Marne, in which the France pushes back, and now we're going to have when the dust settles, it will turn into something of a stalemate. Now, some things that made this war, up to this point at least, completely unique. First of all, the advent of the machine gun, where it was not just a brand new weapon. By now, it had been around for a number of years, and both sides had the machine gun and were quite willing to use it. Secondly, artillery pieces. Again, artillery had been around for quite some time, but this was now mobile artillery. It could move much quicker. The guns were bigger than they ever had been. And so again, everything has enlarged in scale and in size. Next, we have air power. The Wright brothers had invented their airplane, and somebody by now had thought to put guns on those planes. So you have airplanes. Now, they're not carrying a lot in the way of bombs, so they're not going to be able to do major bombing runs. In fact, initially, the airplanes are used primarily for scouting purposes, because now you can fly over an enemy and see where his disposition is, and you can gain intelligence. And of course, both sides had airplanes, and both sides are trying to shoot each other down. They're not limited to airplanes. Air warfare is also the Zeppelin, and here you have a picture of a German Zeppelin that is flying over, in this case, it's flying over Paris. And notice it can actually carry a load of planes as well, but it's much more of a heavy duty, almost like a battleship in the air. What's holding them up? What's holding up a big thing like that? Well, they need a lighter than air gas, and typically they were using hydrogen. Now, the problem with hydrogen is that it's highly flammable. So yes, it can carry a great deal of weight up in the sky, but it doesn't take much of a spark to set it off and to have the entire thing burst into flames. Another weapon that you see here in World War I is the use of poison gas, mustard gas, where this gas would infiltrate people's lungs, and it's like pouring gasoline down in your lungs and then lighting it. It's agonizing and debilitating, and even if you survive, you just become a shell of the person. Your lungs are never going to work right. And after World War I, they will pass Geneva Accords, whereby all countries will agree to no longer use poison gas or engage in chemical warfare. Not all countries have obeyed that, but that has been the case. That has been recognized by quite a number of countries. Radio is also a new, you can't really call it a weapon, but it's used for military purposes, because now instead of sending a runner or somebody with a letter back and forth, you can coordinate your attacks via radio, and this is going to also change the face of warfare. Now, in 1914, you'd had the war begin. The assassination had taken place the month before, but August now the war begins. In fact, somebody wrote a book entitled "The Guns of August," and it's talking about how the war begins. The front lines eventually form, especially between Germany and France, but also in the east as well. Russian troops are repulsed by Germany, but they do inflict heavy losses in Austria. And so it's the Eastern Front is a going concern. And when Christmas comes, now I notice I put temporary truce. This isn't an official truce, but as Christmas Eve and Christmas Day came over the battlefield, In many cases, the soldiers said, wait a minute, we're fighting and we're on the front lines, but it's Christmas. And in a number of cases, they actually came out of their trenches. They wished each other Merry Christmas. They went out into the field. They played soccer together, and sort of an unofficial temporary truce. And when Christmas was over, they went back to their trenches and they resumed the fighting. Now, that only happened the first year. After that, there was heavy military discipline upon those who had participated, especially the officers, and troops were forbidden to what they call fraternize with the enemy in any years after this. So this is the only year that it happened, but it was quite an instance, and maybe suggestive. What would have happened if all the soldiers had said, maybe we shouldn't be fighting, maybe we should just be putting down our weapons and let's let the peace continue. It's tantalizing to just think about what the possibilities could have been. Well, that did not take place, and in 1915, Italy now joined Britain, England, and France in the war. Remember, they had initially been allied with Germany, but they were promised certain concessions where they would get certain lands if they switched sides, and they did. Bulgaria and Turkey also joined the war, but they joined on the side of Germany. Remember, Turkey we called the sick man of Europe, and Turkey and Russia had been enemies in the past, and this continued to place them on opposite sides. And there was also fighting in Macedonia. That's the northern section of Greece. Today there's a separate country called Macedonia, and the Greeks haven't quite forgiven them for using that name. But what's in a name? Well, there was fighting in northern Greece. In 1916, the Germans attack at Verdun, and in that campaign, 1.5 million casualties are seen. The British, they come back with an attack along the Somme. Remember, they've entered the war as well on the side of France. And again, we have huge casualties, 1 million casualties. And Russia attacks on Austria by this time begin to fail. Russia's not doing so well. Of course, Russia had a great many people, but was always a bit behind when it came to material and weaponry. In 1917, you have the Tsar Nicholas of Russia. He abdicates because Russia has been just pushed to complete financial exhaustion by this war. And so the Bolsheviks take Russia. We talked about this when we were looking at communism. And remember how that Germany actually transports Lenin into Russia so that he can help lead this revolution. And the Bolsheviks eventually take Russia toward the end of that year, in October of 1917. They take Russia and they sign a truce with Germany where the fighting in the east will now end. But meanwhile, the United States now enters the war. The United States had stayed out of it for 1914, 1915, 1916, and a good chunk of 1917. But now the United States enters, and the United States is fresh and has not lost all these millions of soldiers in all these years of fighting. So that 1918, the Germans launched their offensive in the West, hoping to put an end to the war because they can see the handwriting on the wall. The Allies break through the German lines, and the Germans actually try to negotiate with President Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, thinking that perhaps because the Americans haven't been in the war that long, that maybe they can negotiate a better deal. And the Kaiser finally abdicates. And up to that point, the Kaiser had been telling the German people, "Oh, we're winning. There's a lot of propaganda going on, and we're winning. We're doing great. But meanwhile, Germany was just falling apart, and financially and in every other way. And so when the Kaiser abdicates, many of the German soldiers thought they had been betrayed. It wasn't betrayal. It was because Germany was about to fall, but they had not realized that. The soldier in the trenches did not realize that, and that's going to create a lot of harsh feelings. Now here's our map at the high point of that war as Germany is getting ready to fall. Notice we've got those countries that are on the Allied powers, Great Britain and France and Italy and the Russian Empire, although they had pulled out. But then against them we have the Ottomans, and that I've just been talking about what happened in Europe. With the Ottomans, the fighting actually takes place in places like outside of Egypt and Arabia. Perhaps you've heard of Lawrence of Arabia and the campaigns in which the Arabs were involved. They came in on the side of the Allies because they were promised freedom, freedom for the Middle East from the Ottomans. And so Germany now is Germany and Austria-Hungary. In fact, there will be no more Austria-Hungarian Empire. It's going to be broken up into a number of small little countries. Germany itself is also going to fall, and we're going to see a number of its territories now seceded to other countries. There had not been complete agreement as we entered this war, and this is illustrated by a sort of an internal, I don't want to call it a conflict, but disagreement at the Gilead Church in Brighton, England, where the pastor, J.K. Popham, had preached from the pulpit actually, that it's the duty of Englishmen to defend one's country. And of course, they saw themselves embroiled in this war. One of his own deacons, John Gosden, said, "Wait a second, this is an unjust war," and yet he served with distinction. He wasn't, even though he said we shouldn't be fighting, and yet he felt it was his duty to serve, but not necessarily to be a combatant. And so instead, he served with distinction as a stretcher bearer. And these two not only disagreed, they actually wrote about their disagreements. So we actually have their issues in writing. They were friends, they respected each other, and yet disagreed strongly. And it's interesting to see how that turned out. Well, the casualties of World War I. Notice all the way over on the left, you look at the casualties of Russia approaching over 900 million. I'm sorry, over 9 million, excuse me. Very intense because it was not just the bullets, but also the starvation. Remember that if you look at the casualties in Russia, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and France, they're up to 6 million and above. But then we go down to England, Great Britain. That's just a little over 3 million. A lot less. And you say, what happened? They were fighting too, but they were not fighting in England. So you don't have civilian casualties. You only have the military casualties. And Italy, much the same way. Turkey, somewhat the same, although perhaps for different reasons. And notice the United States got into the war much, much later. It was 1917 before it's even declared, and 1918 before the troops really arrive ready to actually fight. And so casualties on both sides, and a great, great many died, and a great many more were injured and would suffer those injuries the rest of their lives. Now, the results of World War I. First of all, 3 dynasties were deposed. You have the Habsburgs from Austria, you have the Hohenzollerns from Prussia, and also the Romanovs. Instead of the Tsar, he abdicates, and so you're going to now have the Bolsheviks who take Russia, but also the Treaty of Versailles. When the war ends, and Germany has very obviously been the loser, it was agreed, and Germany didn't want to agree, this was forced upon them, that Germany would pay the bills for the war. And that was an astronomical burden. It was impossible for them to pay. They would have to just print more money. And when you do that, remember the value of your money is supply and demand. So the more money you print, the less valuable it is. And people would go to work that morning and take off for lunch so they could go quickly and buy bread because the price would double by the time they get off work later on in the day. And so Germany was under an unbelievable strain. And then they were also required to disarm, and they were going to be limited as to what sort of forces they could have, what sort of military weapons that they could have. The idea being, the plan was to make sure that Germany could never again fight a war.